Hello and welcome to episode 172 of Prose. This week, go to some extremes to escape a dystopia that is all too familiar. That's right, folks, you heard it correctly. We have one tale today. It is an extra long one, and I certainly enjoyed creating it. Please do remember to go to prosepodcast.com. It is our one-stop shop for all things prose. Additionally, go check out @Prose Podcast on all social media. I would love to hear from you there. I also want to give a quick shout out and thank you to everyone who sent me their Spotify Wraps. It was awesome seeing so many of you listening to the show through Spotify. I love seeing where you're listening and you sharing those things. It really does mean the world. So again, thank you to those that sent me the Spotify things, but also to those that show me the other means through which you're listening to the show. But that's enough of that. Let's get to the tale, shall we? This week, we have To Spite My Face, or Who Ya Hi. Enjoy. To Spite My Face, or Huahai. An original short story by Jared I. McGee. In the wake of the newest strain of the IRV, I saw CCTV cameras and listening discs multiply exponentially. Again. "50 years ago, when the first enlightened one ruled what was then China, the increased surveillance was necessary. No one could argue against it. Long before designer DNA-based vaccines had been discovered, and even longer before they became cost-effective and, therefore, standard, at least for those who had money or station, the first of the modern plagues hit. They called it a pandemic, but I saw the piles of bodies in the old news reports, read about how they ran out of places to bury people. Had someone been dropped in from the history books? Someone from the era of the Spanish flu or the bubonic plague? Whew, those so-called pandemic years. Well, they would have felt right at home for those historical travelers. As the annual variants continued to arise, those same time travelers likely would have wanted to go back to the relative safety of his flu or her plague. China had sought to track its people even closer than it already had been back then. It needed to get a handle on the ravages of the disease. Its dense population and economy saw those initial viruses ransack their way through the country. They desperately needed to follow who was with whom when, so if and when one of those people got sick, they could backtrace and contact trace everyone who might possibly be infected, thereby sniffing out another new flare-up of plague. This was before the enlightened one was the enlightened one, and the party was still in power for appearance's sake. Still, there was enough political power and will to be able to put up hundreds of thousands of cameras and listening devices all throughout China. There was enough force of will and agency of that political apparatus to ensure that all mobile devices had proper tracking software and patriotware, what some people call malware, installed to keep the general peace. This was the nascent era of facial recognition and artificial intelligence. The crude, childish programs used back then are the sort of thing that children write the code for in elementary school these days. Even so, it proved to be an effective method for tracking the party's citizens. The biggest breakthrough of the pandemic years was to have facial recognition be able to recognize a face even with a mask on. PPE was necessary and mandated, so the party couldn't countermount its own order there. So the AI was streamlined and took a major step forward in creating the China that China eventually became. "16 years into the NDE, or New Disease Era, the term this new time to be alive had begun to be lovingly called. The inarguable and infallible nature of the preponderance of surveillance had been chipped away at by a refocusing on biological technologies in the face of what many scientists swore could be an extinction-level event, if the human race didn't act collectively and decisively. We made some major leaps forward, but viruses do not sit idle. It is not in their nature. Flash forward half a century, and the variants of the superbug immunorespiratory virus were deadlier still. Now, Huahai, the IRV strain that has ravaged the world, runs rampant, and all the surveillance tech in all the world wouldn't do anyone any good. All the time, money, and brain power spent on perfecting tracking the population would have been better served being applied to keeping the population alive. The Enlightened One's newest incarnation, Shi Taiyang, now scrambles to keep up with burying those already dead to staunch the flow of Huahai. He and his 10,000 stars can barely manage that, much less find even more biological breakthroughs to combat the virus itself. But they cannot allow Yang Hongjie to list or fall, as what was once China, the Korean Peninsula Republic, Mongolia, and the Viet-Asian Confederacy were now called. Yang Hongjie was Xi's first priority always. It was inborn into him upon spiritual reincarnation going back to the savior Xi Jinping, and so, rather than redouble efforts at further DNA-based work to combat the IRV, the Enlightened One thought that tamping out any sedition or rebellion would be a better use of energies. Those 1,000 stars who weren't busy overseeing the mass graves for those hordes dying across Yang Hongjie monitored their countrymen ever closer. More CCTV. These enabled with the most advanced AI. DNA collection drones, or DCDs, radar, sonar, heat detection, and prejudicial preventative reactionary measures. PPRMs were a fancy way of saying that the cameras at every light post and noodle counter and train terminal could now shoot to kill. How could Shi Taiyang, the Great Sun, as the Enlightened One was often called, conquer the implacable foe of Huahai if he faced disunity in his land? He and his 1,000 stars held that he could not. So the tight hand of the state crushed in closer, cutting off what minuscule breathing room we had. The worst of the state-sponsored killing of those of us who were still healthy fell the hardest on the capitals of the old states. What were once Kuala Lumpur, Mandalay, Bangkok, Phnom Penh, Seoul, Ulaanbaatar, Pyongyang, and many other urban centers saw draconian measures play out. The kill count of the PPRMs rivaling that of Huahai. But this was only natural, of course. These cities were places for learning. The enlightened ones had, for decades, set up universities and laboratories to help combat those of the Western devils. Some of the best and the brightest minds and greatest talents of the world had gathered in these places. With the increased restrictions, these brightest and greatest stepped into the streets to push back against their beloved leader. Everyone quickly learned that those that stepped out did not often step back in. Not after these newest technologies and policies were deployed. I had been tagged as potentially antisocial at birth from the routine DNA readout that the state used to get to know its newest citizens when they arrived in the world. Those antisocial tendencies never showed up in the typical ways that concerned the state, though, largely due to my mother keeping me busy with piano and cello lessons, tai chi, chores around the house, and, among many other things, many other things, really, and honestly, quite fatally, she kept me busy with books. I loved to learn, which led me to a career in academia and research. So I found myself working as a professor of historical truths at Changsha University, the jewel in the enlightened one's crown when the riots broke out, there, in the capital of Yanghongju. From Xingcheng, what Changsha had been redubbed to fit in with the celestial motifs of the enlightened one's rule and to connect back to the city's ancient history, the people began to rise up in force for the first time since the early 2020s final uprisings and before the Great Purge of 2025. The difference now, of course, was that the state could see a face through multiple layers. The nanochips in our bloodstream had us all trackable all day, every day. There was no safe way to resist or protest. They heard everything and saw everything. That British man Orwell's fever dream had nothing on the reach of the great sun and his 1,000 stars. Shenzhen, Star City, was under siege from dissidents and revolutionary scum, they said. Star City was in grave danger, they said. Star City would smite down all who rose up against them, they said. Taking a page out of many dictators' playbooks, Shi Taiyang ordered that the universities be closed and all men and women of learning be detained. This was a certain trip to the death camps of Ulzit, far out in the deserts of what was once Mongolia. Re-education was a thing of the past. When a street lamp could, would, and very often did kill, being carted off for mass murder was something that did not seem too far-fetched. The only thing I could think of was to think of a way to beat the surveillance systems and make a run for it. the impossible. I bought an antiquated CRISPR-Cas9 system first. Working quickly, I edited my DNA as much as I could. I injected myself with myriad bacteria and induced septicemia, keeping myself on IVs to ensure that I did not die. The sepsis was meant to clean my blood of all the little nanoreceptors that lived in my bloodstream. I didn't think I could kill them, but damaging them seemed a good idea before any attempt at escape. Along with changing my DNA and trying my best to purge my blood, I burned my fingertips off on the state-provided stove. I manipulated the pigment melanin in my irises and made my eyes a blazing blue. I bronzed my skin with a similar procedure. And the list goes on. The pain was significant, but I thought that the crucible was my penance for my position with the university. My career had been spent cleaning up inconvenient historical truths and parroting the lies the regime had been telling for a century. I deserved to hurt. All of my metamorphoses were easy, and with modern technology, easily done in the confines of my home. But, as the black market had been completely shut down by all the blind eyes the Thousand Stars took, suddenly regaining sight, I was left without a way of changing my physical appearance any more than I already had. Darker skin, lighter eyes, and a shaved head would trick a human eye, but the face-shape tracking tech that was in all the CCTVs would see through these superficial changes immediately. No, they could no longer symbol-scan my DNA nanotrackers along with my DNA, along with my fingerprints, and so on. But that in and of itself would also raise flags. I needed to alert nothing in the surveillance apparatus so there wouldn't be a second look. I needed to be a ghost. I needed to be some shadow with no connection to me. A plastic surgeon could have been a godsend. That is what I needed. However, those services would not be available now, to be sure, though I likely could not have found a surgeon even in the best of times. Changing physical appearance was something that was rare among anyone but the super elite of Yang Hung Jie. It was when the raid sirens came on that I decided I had to act drastically and decisively. I knew my time was up and that they would come for me. Those sirens only come on when Yang Hung Jie is under attack. Whether it is in Beijing or Bangkok or Xinjiang, the sirens come on nationwide. There are different rhythms, different tones depending on what is happening. We learn this auditory messaging from childhood. These sirens meant that the very capital was thought to be under direct attack from foreign devils or their agents. Having been one to reshape history for Xi, I knew that this was generally used to round up and clear out any resistance before said resistance could, well, resist. They were coming for those of us who knew things. Knew anything, really. The learned classes would need to be ended in the sands of Ulzit. And now... I took out my bread knife, and I sawed at my nose. Starting at the top of the cartilage, I sawed quickly, methodically. Despite the searing pain and the bile rising into my throat, it went quickly. The nose is not attached too terribly securely when it comes down to it. I then did the same with my left ear, tugging down, putting just a little pressure on, and then sawing downward. Then my right. In my inspiration, I cut the chunkier bits of my upper cheeks off too. The places right under the eyes. The meat that scrunches up when one smiles, as if I remembered how to do that anymore. I had a metal spatula nearby that I heated on my stove. I put my IV apparatus back together and injected it as the metal warmed. Once white hot, I took the spatula and scored my flesh, staunching the blood flow. As I had feared, I passed out. Two hours later, I awoke from the blood loss and shock caused by my mutilation. The IV had kept me hydrated, medicated, and likely alive, just as planned. The medicines that joined my bloodstream with the liquids also had brought me back awake more quickly than had I waited to naturally awaken. This would be my salvation. The sirens still wailed. I grabbed the one bag I would be taking with me. It had hidden compartments for data chips and even hard currency, both of which I had a little. The currency might come in handy in the rural areas. The data chips had some electronic funds, yes, but far more importantly, it had all the data I had pilfered from the university over the years. The last theft had been from a lab from the science wing of the history department. I had terabyte after terabyte of historical data on the evolution of Huahai and all the other IRV strains. The hidden compartment was lead-lined and reflective of any number of surveillance scans. Laser, heat. It was a vault. I also grabbed the vape pens that I'd rigged to deliver antibiotics and painkillers. If anyone looked at my bag, it would look like I had a pretty severe nicotine or THC habit, rather than a bag full of drugs to help me keep moving. With one last look in the mirror, I saw that I looked like a leper. Like one of the countless poor simply trying to survive the horrors of everyday life, much less the ravages of Huahai and Shi Taiyang. Being in the very center of the Yonghungian Empire, there was no good way out. Thousands and thousands of miles stood between me and the next global power. I couldn't try for the coast. Too much of Xi's power was clustered there, aimed toward the US and, far closer, the Japanese, the one stubborn Asian and Pacific holdout against Yonghungjie. So I decided to make for Lhasa, historical capital of Tibet, and continued thorn in Xi's side. If I could make it there, I could hit the main artery of Tibet, the old G318 highway that would take me west. The Yindu would be my saviors then. The Bharatian League, often called the Sanatan Empire, as a direct thumb in the eye of Yang Hongjie, was not quite a full check on Xi's aggressive expansionism, but they had stood their own for a couple decades now, and I would have to hope that they would welcome an academic with some secrets to tell. As I made my way into the streets, none of the CCTV cams sent any flares up. No shift in the siren's song came. No PPRMs came hurtling toward me to incapacitate or kill me. As I made my way through the streets, I laughed, despite the pain from doing so. Making my way with the waning sun, heading westward, I couldn't help myself. I was eager to tell the secret histories of Yang Hongjie to the Bharatian League. I was excited to experience a new eternal empire in those Sanatans. I was giddy to know that I was doing harm to Xi Taiyang, the Thousand Stars, and maybe even to the despicable Huahai. It was all invigorating and sustaining as I continued to bleed, having cut off my nose to spite my face. Thank you for listening to Spite My Face, or Huahai, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. All sounds you have heard throughout this short story come from freesound.org or YouTube's free audio library. Everything is being used under CC 1.0 public domain dedication licenses. And that does it this week for Prose. We will be back in 2 weeks' time, meaning our next episode will fall directly on Christmas. However, you all know how much I love a holiday, particularly this set of holidays, so please refresh your feed and keep your eyes open and your ears ready for some extra prose in your feeds coming up. But until those show up, please do love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, always stranger than fiction. Thank you all so much for listening,